Well, hello and welcome back to another basic lesson in music theory. Today I am going to be talking about note names on the staff. This is a follow-up to the major and minor second lesson. Some of my students really struggled with the major and minor seconds, and that's mainly because we didn't identify what the notes are on the staff. And so let's flip over again to our screen where we can show some images of music notation. So as we review this is just, again, a basic review of the music staff and the notes on the music staff. If you aren't able to identify the notes on the staff, then you won't be able to identify whether a second is a major, which is a whole step, or a minor, which is a half step. And of course, these items are fundamental to the understanding of music. So I helped one of my students who contacted me and said, I'm not getting this whole major and minor second thing. And when I talked to them online, we quickly discovered, oh, that's because the note names, when we remove the note names from the staff, like these, once we remove the names, well, they all look the same, right? So let's jump in and just do a really quick lesson on the note names. So if we're using musictheory.net, and it's a great place to go because you can review this anytime on your own. So the staff, simply 5 lines, 4 spaces. The modern staff, we see them numbered always from the bottom to the top when we're looking at a staff. So when we're talking about first line, second line, third, fourth, and fifth, that's what we're referring to. Each of these lines, they correspond to a specific note on the piano keyboard. And that's why I showed you last week the keyboard. It shows us the layout of the notes. Now, what this is actually showing you here as the notes are ascending through the staff is a treble clef in relation to the notes on the keyboard. And that's really important. That student who contacted me said that they weren't really sure what notes are we even looking at. Well, the treble clef would be for those singers who are sopranos and altos. Many times in our elementary schools, we're using the treble staff because the treble clef is the clef that most young singers are singing in. You'll also see some of our tenor music. If you're in a 4-part chorus, the tenor music will also be written on a treble clef, but many times it will have an octave indicator below the staff or below the treble clef sign. So the clefs are either the treble clef or the bass clef. And those are going to be identifying which notes you're going to be looking at or using note names on the staff itself. So the treble clef, like I indicated earlier, if a tenor, which is a male voice, is singing using a treble clef, it will have an 8 below the clef sign, and that simply means that they're singing an octave lower than what the altos or sopranos would be singing without that 8 below that clef sign. This is a treble clef. It's also known as a G clef because it identifies the G on the staff. And it does that by the body, the main body of the clef sign circles around the G. Therefore, we see this note is identified as a G on the staff. That's really important because all of the other letters or all of the other notes around this note are going to then be identified by a letter name. We use in our musical alphabet A through G and then start over again with A. So in this case, this is identified as a G on a treble clef. The note then following it starts the alphabet again with an A. Then we're going to find that the line above it is is a B, followed by a C, a D, an E, an F, and a G. It's funny how many times my younger students, when I'm teaching this, will say, I didn't realize that that followed the alphabet. And so that's all it does. the process continues as we go up from the G all the way up to the high G. The next line above it now, we run out of space, so we use what is called a ledger line. And that ledger line simply adds one more line above the staff that we can add a note to. And you can have multiple ledger lines above the staff. Flute players, for instance, are very familiar with these ledger lines as they move up through the staff. And there we have it. So that would be the A above it. Now, the bass clef, on the other hand, as we see the bass clef here indicated, it's going to identify a different note on the staff as a foundational note. The treble clef was a G clef because it identified the G. The F clef identifies an F on the staff. So we see the F identified. Now all of the notes are going to be based on that F. Again, we're going to do the same thing we did in the treble clef and just follow the alphabet. F, G, after G comes an A, B, and a C. And so we see this happening. They only show the notes that are on the staff itself, but if you follow the alphabet, the bottom line on a bass clef is a G, followed by an A, B, a C as we ascend right through the alphabet, a D, an E, an F, and of course the G and the A. So musictheory.net does a great job of showing you what a grand staff is. So if we connected the bass clef to a treble clef, we would end up with all of these lines. That's too many lines to try in our mind. If we had notes on all of these lines, that would be crazy. But the piano needs to use both bass clef and treble clef on what we call a grand staff. And so what we do is we take two staffs and we put one under the other. So we have a bass clef and a treble clef. In the middle, they've just removed that middle line. And that middle line is what we refer to as middle C. So here we have a bass clef and a treble clef. What is going to link them together is our middle C, and I'll show you how that works here. In bass clef, we've already established this fourth line is an F, followed by a G in the fourth space up, followed by an A on that fifth line. A B would rest right on top of the staff. A C would be one ledger line up. While in treble clef, going from that C, which is the ledger line below the staff, we would have a D resting below the staff, an E, an F, and a G. And so it would actually look like this. The C, a D, an E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So when we then move into the study of seconds and the intervals between notes, right? That's what we were talking about in our last lesson was intervals. And by the way, we want to then get into major scales, but we were working interval identification. And so my students were asking, well, how does this work? I'm not making a connection. Well, the first thing is we had to understand that the C to the D, or excuse me, the note names on the staff. So if you're a bass clef reader, you have to know those bass clef notes. Because when we go back and we start identifying, well, what is this, a major? Is it a whole step or a half step? Well, we have to be able to first say, what are the note names? In this case, F, A, C, and of course the memory tools. As I pointed those out to my student, it was like, oh yeah, I do remember those. We learned those in elementary school, right? That the spaces spell the word face, F-A-C-E. And that one of the memory sentences we can use to remember the lines in treble clef every good boy does fine, or every good boy deserves fudge. Either way, that's just a simple way to recall, oh, that's right. So spaces, F-A-C, this is a C. Every good boy deserves fudge, D, C to a D. And of course, if you remember what we just pointed out, this follows the alphabet. So if you identify the first one, the next note in sequence is going to be the next note in the alphabet, C to a D. So all of that now comes together when we go back and we look at a piano keyboard. So we had to identify C to a D. And if we go back to that piano keyboard, which is on their home page, and I pointed out a C to a D, remembering that the note to the left of the two keys is a C. Half step up would be a D flat. C to a D is a whole step. So that was the question. What was a C to a D? C to a D, whole step. Piano shows that so well. So as I was working with this student, and I pointed out, again, the idea that there are two places on the staff between notes that are natural notes, no flats, no sharps. There are two places that it's a half step. A B to a C is a half step. No black key in between them. B to a C, always half step. E to an F, always half step. E to an F, half step. B to C, half step. All of the other natural notes are one whole step apart. So a G to an A, whole step. A to a B, whole step. C to a D, whole step. D to an E, whole step. But you have to remember, two half steps are in this natural sequence of notes. There's a half step between a B and a C, and a half step between an E and an F. If we can remember that, then the major and minor second identification becomes much easier. So we have the F to a G, whole step. So if we put a flat in front of the G, lowering it by one half step, that's what a flat does. Now all of a sudden the F to a G flat is a half step. Okay, so here's a way, just finishing up the lesson then, there is a way that we can see that a little more clearly. So if I open up, let's open up my window here. Let me share the screen. I'm going to jump over now to my Sibelius window, and I can show you this. So we have notes in treble clef and in bass clef. So this is what I did with the student the other day. I asked, what is this note and what is that note? Well, she said, well, let's see, F, A, C, E. That's an E. And this is every good boy deserves fudge, F, E to an F. E to F, she said, I'm remembering that you said in E to an F is a half step. That's a minor second. Bingo, minor second. So we can take this note and I can change the interval now, and I can say, well, what are these notes? And she said, every good boy deserves. Okay, that's a D, F-A-C-E, D to an E. Well, our half steps were B to C or E to F. So she said a D to an E, that must be a whole step. She was correct. So I said, what if I take this note and I added, let's say I add this to it. Now it's a D to an E flat. She said, let's see, a flat lowers the pitch by one half step. So without the flat, a D to an E was a whole step. I add the flat, and that lowers that top note by a half step. That must mean that this is now a half step, and she was correct in that. This turns it into a minor second. So it's really important to first be able to name the notes. Then remember, B to C is a half step, E to F, half step. All of the others are whole steps. Once you can work through all of that, then you've got it. You're well on your way to being able to identify whether a note is a whole step apart or a half step apart. You can do this. So it's really fun to begin to understand, how does music work together? So I am going to be putting together, my next video is going to be on a major scale. Once you get note names, identifying major and minor seconds, you're ready then to begin to understand, how do we build a major scale? So I hope that you found this little review very helpful on note names, and that I guarantee that understanding note names on the staff will help you as you move forward and you build all of the rest of the music theory blocks in this sequence. So I hope that you're enjoying yourself. Again, we're all about making music here, so if you're not making music, well, you're not having fun. If it's all a study of how is music built, well, it's probably not going to be fun. So get out there and make music as you're doing this, and putting all the building blocks together then just helps to fill out the mind and the understanding. But it's no fun unless you're making music. So make some music today and enjoy yourself. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you in the next lesson. Bye.